They called her a burden. They said no man would choose her. Her family pushed her out onto the street with a small suitcase and a one-way train ticket to the Wild West, as if that were the kindest way to get rid of someone. But two strangers saw what the world overlooked, and the man standing behind them, the man who said nothing, was the only one who didn't look at her with contempt. Like, comment the city you're watching in so I know how far this story has progressed, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part. The morning they threw her out, it was raining. Not the kind of rain that washes things clean, the kind that soaks through wool and sits cold against your skin for hours after you've come inside. Maeve Holloway stood on the front porch of her parents' house in Caldwell, Kansas, holding a canvas bag that contained everything she now owned in the world: 2 dresses, a pair of worn boots, a tin comb, and 43 cents. Her mother hadn't come to the door. Her father had handed her the bag and the train ticket without meeting her eyes. "This is the most decent thing we can do for you," he said. "Don't make it harder than it has to be." She had been 23 years old for 11 days. The ticket was one way: west. A town called Blackridge that she'd never heard of, printed on a card so thin the ink had already started to blur from the damp. She didn't ask what was waiting for her there, because she understood enough from the pamphlet her father had left on the kitchen table 3 weeks earlier, the one with the words "Frontier Brides Placement Service" printed across the top in stern black type. She hadn't touched it. She'd pretended she hadn't seen it, and then her husband had died and the pretending stopped. Thomas Holloway had been dead for 6 weeks. He was 31 years old, a quiet man who sold dry goods and came home smelling of cedar and flower dust. He had married Maeve 2 years before, despite her mother's barely concealed opinion that he was settling, and in those 2 years he had never once made her feel like a burden. He died of a fever that moved through his lungs in 4 days flat. The doctor said there was nothing to be done. The town said otherwise. The town, meaning the women who gathered after church, meaning her mother's friends, meaning the particular kind of cruelty that wears the face of concern, decided that Maeve had somehow contributed. Not directly. Nothing so honest as an accusation. It was the way people said, "Well, you know how she kept the house and let the silence carry the rest." It was the neighbor who mentioned, not unkindly, that perhaps a man needed a wife who could keep up with him. It was her own mother, sitting across the kitchen table 3 days after the funeral, saying, "Maeve, you have to understand that at your size, men already start with certain doubts." She hadn't answered. She'd stared at the wood grain on the tabletop until the words stopped meaning anything. By the time the train ticket appeared, she was too tired to fight it. The train west was crowded in the way that made you aware of every inch of space you occupied. Maeve found a seat near the back of the car and tucked her bag under her knees and looked out the window at the flattening land. The woman beside her, pretty, small-boned, nervous, introduced herself as Clara and immediately began talking about the man waiting for her in a town called Renfrew. His name was Henry. He had a farm. He'd sent a photograph. "Do you have a photograph?" Clara asked. "No," Maeve said. "A letter at least? From your match?" "I don't have a match." Clara looked at her the way people look at something they feel sorry for, but also slightly uncomfortable around. "Oh," she said, "you're going unmatched?" "I'm going," Maeve said. "That's all I know." Clara didn't say anything after that for a while, which Maeve appreciated. She watched the Kansas prairie give way to empty miles of scrub and red earth and tried not to think about what she was heading toward. She had no particular hope. Hope felt like something she'd used up. What she had instead was a flat, practical understanding that she needed to eat and sleep somewhere, and that somewhere was going to have to be west. The trouble started around the second day, when the other women on the car began to speak more freely. There were 9 of them altogether, all traveling under the same placement service, all carrying the same thin pamphlets, all heading to towns with names that sounded invented. By the second afternoon, they'd formed the kind of loose social order that women form quickly when they're anxious. The confident ones at the front of the car, the quieter ones in the middle, and Maeve at the back, which suited her fine until a woman named Dorothea decided it didn't. Dorothea was from St. Louis. She wore her hair in a style that required more pins than Maeve owned, and she had the particular manner of someone who had been complimented her whole life and considered it a fact of nature rather than a circumstance. She came down the aisle on the afternoon of the second day, steadying herself against the seat backs, and stopped when she reached Maeve. "You're going to Blackridge?" Dorothea said, reading from a list. "As an unmatched." "That's right." "They allow that?" "Apparently." Dorothea looked her over slowly. Not with hatred. That would have been easier. With the kind of careful, almost clinical assessment that's designed to make the person being assessed feel like livestock. "I suppose they take anyone who pays the fee," she said finally, and moved back up the aisle. Clara, who had heard, looked at her lap. Maeve looked out the window. She didn't cry. She'd run low on that too. Blackridge came into view on a Thursday afternoon, rising up out of the flatland like something that hadn't quite decided whether it wanted to be a town yet. There was a main street, unpaved, rutted deep from recent rain, lined with false-fronted buildings that leaned slightly in different directions, as if they'd been arguing. A general store, a livery, a building with no sign that was probably a saloon, a church with a bell tower missing its bell. The train platform was populated by a small collection of men in various states of self-consciousness. The matched ones, Maeve understood, holding handwritten signs with names on them. She scanned for hers and found nothing, which was expected. She was unmatched. She had no plan beyond presenting herself to the placement office, which Clara had said would be in the general store, and asking what came next. She was the last one off the train. The platform was already alive with introductions. Nervous laughter, handshakes, a woman named Ruth being embraced by a wide-shouldered farmer who looked like he'd rehearsed the smile. Maeve moved through it carrying her bag, watching the ground to avoid the worst of the mud, and nearly walked into a group of women who'd gathered near the platform steps. They were townsfolk. She understood this immediately. The way they stood, unhurried, the proprietary ease of people on their own ground. There were 4 of them, middle-aged, watching the arrivals with the attentiveness of people who considered this their entertainment. "Lord, look at that one," said the shortest of them. Quiet, but not quiet enough. Maeve kept walking. "What kind of placement office sends them out like that?" another one said. "The kind that'll take anyone's money, I expect." She was 3 feet past them when the laughter came. Not cruel laughter exactly, just the easy laughter of people who don't think about the weight of what they're finding funny. Maeve didn't stop. She kept her eyes forward and her chin level and her pace steady, and she counted her steps until she was off the platform and onto the main street, and the laughter was behind her. She stopped beside a hitching post and set her bag down and breathed for a moment. The street was busy in the way of a small town on a delivery day. Wagons, horses, men in conversation, a dog asleep in a shaft of light between 2 buildings. No one paid her particular attention yet, which she found she was grateful for. She needed a minute. Just one. She was still standing there when she heard them. That one. The voice was small, certain, the voice of someone who had made a decision. Maeve turned. 2 girls. Identical, somewhere around 7 years old, dark-haired and dirt-smudged and wearing dresses that had been mended so many times the original fabric was hard to identify, were standing on the edge of the boardwalk 6 feet away, staring at her with the kind of flat, open scrutiny that only small children manage without embarrassment. One of them had her arm extended, pointing directly at Maeve. "That's the one we want," she said. Her twin sister nodded once with great seriousness. Maeve looked behind her. Nothing. "Are you—" she started. "We picked you," the pointing girl said, as if this settled the matter entirely. "You can't just—" Maeve stopped. "Who are you?" "I'm Lily," said the one who had spoken. She pointed at her sister. "That's June. Our papa's over there." She gestured down the boardwalk without looking. Maeve looked where Lily pointed. The man standing 30 feet down the boardwalk was watching. He was tall, not in a way that announced itself, just solidly tall, the kind of tall that comes with work rather than genetics. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, a jaw that hadn't been shaved in several days, and an expression that Maeve could not read at all. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't frowning. He was simply watching, with his hat in his hand and his arms at his sides, waiting. When he saw her looking, he walked toward her, unhurried. He stopped a few feet away and looked at his daughters first, then at her. "You're unmatched," he said. Yes, I'm Gideon Mercer. He didn't extend his hand. He didn't look her over the way Dorothea had. He looked at her face. I've got a ranch about 4 miles out. It's in rough shape. I've got 2 daughters who need— He paused. Something more than I've been able to give them. Maeve waited. I'm not offering much, he said. Room and board while we work out the arrangement. I'm not going to promise anything that isn't mine to promise yet. That's honest, she said. He nodded once. Can you work? Yes. That's all I need to know right now. He picked up her bag before she could, which surprised her. He handed it to Lily, who accepted the responsibility with tremendous gravity. Gideon turned and started down the boardwalk, and his daughters fell in on either side of Maeve without ceremony, and just like that she was walking with them, 3 steps behind a stranger who hadn't looked at her size or her clothes or her station, only at her face. She heard a woman's voice from the direction of the general store, one of the placement service matrons, or maybe a townswoman. She couldn't tell. Is that Mercer taking the big one? He has lost his mind. She heard it. She kept walking. The wagon ride to the ranch was mostly silent. The twins sat between Maeve and their father on the wagon bench, which meant she spent the 4 miles pressed slightly against the edge of the seat, while Lily leaned against her left arm with the ease of a child who has decided a thing and sees no reason to second-guess it. June sat in the middle and said nothing but watched Maeve with a steady, appraising look that felt strangely familiar. It was the same look Gideon had, Maeve realized, the same patience, the same stillness. What happened to the last woman? Maeve asked, about 2 miles out. She felt Gideon's posture shift slightly. There wasn't one, he said. I wrote to the placement office 8 months ago. Never went through with sending the letter until last month. Why last month? He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. June stopped eating, he said finally. Not sick. Just stopped. Doctor said she was grieving. He kept his eyes on the road. Their mother died 14 months ago. Maeve looked at June, who was still watching her. I'm sorry, Maeve said. June didn't respond to that, but a moment later, very slowly, she reached out and put 3 fingers on the back of Maeve's hand where it rested on her knee. Not a grip, just a placement, like she was checking to see if something was real. Maeve didn't move her hand. The ranch came into view as the sun was starting to angle west, throwing long shadows across a spread that had clearly once been well kept and was now fighting to hold itself together. The farmhouse was solid but weathered, one shutter hanging loose, the porch rail sagging on the left side. The barn beyond it listed slightly. Fencing along the near pasture had sections down, and the kitchen garden, she could see it from the drive, was overgrown with a season and a half of neglect. It was a lot of work. She felt something shift in her chest at the sight of it, not despair. The opposite. Work she understood. Work was a language she'd spoken her whole life. Gideon pulled the wagon around to the back and helped the girls down. He glanced at Maeve, then at the house. There's a room off the kitchen, he said. Small. You'll have it to yourself. Thank you. I'll get the horses settled. The girls can show you where things are. He unhitched the team without ceremony and led them toward the barn. And Maeve stood in the yard with the twins in her canvas bag and looked at the house and the neglected garden and the listing barn and the long orange light coming over the ridge. Lily tugged her sleeve. You want to see your room? Yes, Maeve said. I do. She followed them inside. The kitchen was dusty and dim, the kind of dim that comes from curtains kept half drawn too long. There were dishes stacked to dry from what looked like 2 days ago. The floor had been swept, but not recently. On the table was a tin mug with a dried ring of coffee in the bottom, and beside it, a child's drawing. A house, 2 stick figures, a large scribbled shape that might have been a horse or a cow, colored in with what looked like every crayon available. June did that, Lily said. Maeve looked at it. The 2 stick figures were holding hands. It's good, she said. June, who had followed them into the kitchen, looked at the drawing and then at the floor, but the edge of her mouth moved just slightly. The room off the kitchen was exactly as described. Small, a single window, a narrow iron bed with a quilt that had been laundered recently enough to smell like it. Someone had made the bed. Gideon, she guessed, which for some reason made her chest ache a little. She set her bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the mattress and looked at her hands. Outside, she could hear the sound of the horses being settled into the barn, the clank of the stall latch, the low voice of a man talking to animals the way some men do, quietly, the way they won't talk to people. She had no idea what came next. She had nothing and no one and no promises and no plan, and the family she'd come from had put her on a train west to be rid of her. And the town she'd arrived in had laughed at her on the platform, and she was sitting on a narrow bed in a stranger's drafty house with 43 cents and 2 dresses and no idea what morning was going to look like. But 2 small girls had pointed at her in a crowd of women and said, "That's the one." And a man she'd known for 4 hours had picked up her bag without being asked. She pressed her hands flat against her knees and breathed. It wasn't much, but it was the most she'd been given in a long time, and she intended to earn it. She didn't sleep well that first night. The mattress was harder than she was used to, and the house made sounds, the settling kind, old wood talking to itself in the dark, that kept pulling her back from the edge of sleep. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, she gave up and lay there listening to the wind move through the gap under the window frame, staring at the ceiling and thinking about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of exhaustion. By the time the sky outside started going gray, she was already dressed. She found the kitchen cold and the stove unlit, and half a bag of cornmeal in the pantry beside a tin of lard and some dried beans that had been there long enough to look doubtful. There were eggs. She found them in a basket on the back shelf, 1.5 dozen, fresher than she expected. She got the stove going with wood from the pile on the porch and started a pot of coffee and cracked 8 eggs into a pan, and by the time she heard the first sounds of the house waking up, the kitchen smelled like something habitable again. Lily appeared first, hair loose and tangled, still in her nightgown, stopping in the kitchen doorway with an expression of complete surprise. "You cooked," she said. "Yes." "Papa never cooks until after he does the horses." "Then he'll have something hot waiting," Maeve said. Lily came and sat at the table and watched her with the steady attention of a child conducting a study. June appeared a few minutes later, dressed already. Shoes buttoned wrong on the left foot, which Maeve noticed but said nothing about. June looked at the pan, then at Maeve, then sat down beside her sister. Gideon came in from outside 20 minutes later, boots already dirty, and stopped just inside the kitchen door the same way Lily had. He looked at the table, eggs, cornbread she'd managed from the meal, coffee, and then at Maeve. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I was up anyway." He hung his hat on the hook by the door and washed his hands at the basin and sat down. He ate without talking, which she'd already understood was his manner. The twins talked enough for the table, Lily, primarily, covering the topics of a loose tooth, a bird she'd seen on the fence post, and a detailed complaint about the condition of the schoolhouse floor. Gideon listened and responded in short, accurate sentences, and once, when Lily said something particularly dramatic about the schoolhouse, the corner of his mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. Maeve drank her coffee and mostly listened. After breakfast, when the girls had gone to change for school, Gideon carried his plate to the basin and then stood there a moment with his back to her. "I appreciate the meal," he said, "but you don't need to take on the cooking. That's not what the arrangement is." "What is the arrangement exactly?" she asked. Not sharply, she genuinely wanted to know. He turned around. He looked uncomfortable in the way of a man who has thought about something a great deal and still hasn't found the right words for it. "I don't know yet," he said. "I'll be honest with you about that. I don't know what I'm offering or what's fair to ask." "Then I'll tell you what I'm offering," she said. "I can work. I can cook and mend and manage a household, and I'm not afraid of hard weather or long days. I don't need you to decide anything right now. I just need something to do." He looked at her for a moment. "The garden's a wreck," he said. "I saw. Fencing on the east pasture needs patching. I can't get to it this week. Show me where the tools are." He showed her. The garden took 4 days. It wasn't glamorous work. Most of it was pulling, weeks of overgrowth, weeds that had threaded themselves through the soil so thoroughly they'd become part of it, plants that had bolted and gone woody and needed to come out entirely so the bed could be reset. She worked in the mornings before the heat peaked, and again in the late afternoon, and by the end of the second day her hands were raw in a way that made gripping the hoe difficult, but she kept going because stopping felt worse. On the third day, Lily came home from school, dropped her books on the porch, and appeared in the garden without being asked. "What do I do?" she said. Maeve looked at her. "Can you pull without yanking, slow and straight so the roots come with it?" "I think so." "Then start there." She pointed to the near row. Lily worked beside her for 2 hours, asking questions the entire time. About seeds, about which plants were weeds and which weren't, about whether tomatoes were a fruit or a vegetable, and why anyone cared. Maeve answered all of it, and when Lily got tired and her pulling got sloppy, Maeve showed her how to brace her knee against the ground and use her weight instead of her arms. "My mama used to do the garden," Lily said, not leading anywhere with it, just saying it. "Do you remember what she grew?" "Sunflowers." She pulled a stubborn root loose and examined it. She said they were the only thing pretty enough to bother with. "Practical woman," Maeve said. Lily looked up. "Is that good?" "In my experience," Maeve said, "yes." Lily seemed satisfied with this and went back to pulling. June never came to the garden, but Maeve noticed her on the porch some afternoons, sitting with her knees up, watching. She didn't call her over. She figured June would come when she was ready, or she wouldn't, and either way forcing it would accomplish nothing. The fencing was harder and took longer because she'd never done it. Not properly, not the frontier kind with post setting and wire and all the particular stubbornness of ground that doesn't want to cooperate. She found the post driver in the barn and made enough sense of it by trial and considerable error over the first afternoon to get 3 posts set, which wasn't impressive but was a start. The next morning she came back and set 4 more, and by the end of the week the east pasture line was patched well enough to hold, if not pretty. She was hammering the last staple into the wire when she heard Gideon's horse behind her. She didn't stop. She finished the staple, checked the tension on the wire, and turned around. He was sitting on his horse at the edge of the pasture, looking at the fence. He didn't say anything for a moment. "That'll hold," he said finally. "Should hold through winter if the posts stay solid. Third one from the left is a little shallow. I'll reset it when the ground softens." He looked at her. "Where'd you learn fencing?" "I didn't," she said. "I figured it out." He was quiet again. Then, "Come look at the barn roof when you've got a minute. There's a section on the east side." "I can look now if you want." He rode around to the barn and she followed on foot, and he pointed out the problem from the ground. A section of shake that had come loose and was letting water in above the hayloft. And they stood there looking at it together, and she was aware that this was the longest conversation they'd had about anything that wasn't the girls or breakfast, and that it felt unexpectedly like something. "I can get up there," she said. "It's steep." "I've been on steep roofs before." He looked at her. "I wasn't saying you couldn't." "All right," she said. She went up on the barn roof on a Tuesday morning when Gideon had ridden out to the far pasture and the twins were at school. She wasn't sure why she waited until she was alone to do it. Maybe because she didn't want an audience for the parts where she slipped, which happened twice on the way up and once coming down. The repair itself was straightforward enough. Pull the loose shakes, replace with the cut pieces she'd found in the lumber stack behind the barn, nail them down in the right overlap. It took 2 hours and she descended with splinters in both palms and a bruise forming on her left knee where she'd caught the ladder wrong, but the section was solid. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't need to. That night at supper, Gideon looked at the ceiling for a moment in the absent way of someone running through a mental checklist and then looked at her across the table. "You did the roof," he said. "Yes." "I would have gotten to it." "I know. I had time this morning." He nodded slowly and went back to eating. The twins looked between them with the attentiveness of children who understand that something is happening even if they can't name it. It went on like that for several weeks. She found the work and she did it. Not to prove anything, or she told herself that, though she understood there was some proving happening whether she intended it or not. The kitchen curtains came down and got washed. The loose porch rail got braced with a new bracket she found in a coffee can of miscellaneous hardware in the barn. She turned the garden beds and got seedlings started in tin cups on the windowsill. She learned the household rhythms. When Gideon came in for morning chores, when the twins needed help with their schoolwork, when June was most likely to talk, versus most likely to disappear into silence. June was the thing she thought about most some nights. Lily had taken to her fast and completely, with the confidence of a child who had made a correct decision and saw no reason to doubt herself. June was different. She wasn't hostile. She was something harder to work with than hostile. She was careful. She observed everything and committed to nothing, and Maeve respected it even as it made things difficult, because she understood it. She had been that child herself, once, the one who waited to see if something was real before she let herself want it. The breakthrough came at the end of the third week, in the kitchen, on a Wednesday evening. Maeve was darning socks at the table, a chore she'd taken on because the twins were wearing through their heels at a rate that suggested they approached walking as a competitive sport. When June appeared in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown, which meant she was supposed to be in bed. "Can't sleep?" Maeve asked without looking up from the sock. Silence for a moment. Then, "My shoes hurt." Maeve set down the sock. "Which foot?" "Both." She looked up. June came to the table and sat down, and Maeve crouched and took off her shoes and pressed carefully along the sides of her feet, and she found it immediately. The leather had been resoled at some point, and the stitching at the inner seam was raised, riding against the arch. "These have been hurting you a while," she said. "A while?" June admitted. "Why didn't you say something?" June looked at the table. "Papa has a lot of things to fix." Maeve held the shoe for a moment and didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say to that wouldn't land wrong. She went to the sewing kit and found her smallest awl and spent 20 minutes carefully loosening and flattening the interior stitching, then patted both inner soles with a strip of soft wool from an old muffler she'd found in the rag bin. She handed them back. June put them on and stood up and walked to the door and back. She didn't say thank you immediately. She sat back down at the table across from Maeve and watched her pick up the darning again. "I didn't think you'd stay," June said. Maeve looked at her. "What made you think that?" "People don't stay." She said it the way children say hard things, flatly, as a statement of observed fact rather than a complaint. "The woman before the arrangement, the neighbors who came after Mama died, they all left." "I'm not planning to leave," Maeve said. "Papa didn't think the arrangement would work," June said. "I heard him tell Mr. Calloway he didn't think anyone would want to come out here." "Your sister pointed at me on a train platform," Maeve said. "I don't think she gave me a lot of choice." Something happened to June's face at that. A small internal struggle, and then something won, and she smiled. It was a small smile, closed mouth, cautious, the smile of someone who hasn't used it in a while and isn't entirely sure the machinery still works. But it was there. "Lily's like that," she said. "I noticed." June stood up and smoothed her nightgown and picked up her shoes and then stopped at the kitchen door. "The cornbread you make is better than Papa's," she said. "His comes out like a brick." "I won't tell him you said so." "He knows," June said, and went to bed. "Bomo Bom Shane." Maeve sat with that for a while after the girl had gone, the darning loose in her hands, the kitchen quiet around her. She was not fooling herself. She knew what this wasn't. It wasn't settled, wasn't permanent, wasn't anything she could count on with certainty. Gideon watched her every day with an expression she still couldn't fully read, and she had no idea what he was deciding or when he would decide it, and the town of Blackridge had not become friendlier. She'd gone to the general store twice now, and both times the reception had been the kind of politeness that is actually its opposite, the women at the counter who answered her questions in monosyllables, the ones who spoke to each other in slightly louder voices when she was nearby. She'd overheard, on the second trip, a woman named Hendricks, she'd caught the name from the conversation, saying to the woman beside her, "Mercer always was odd, sending away for that." A pause. "He'll come to his senses." Maeve had bought her flour and her salt and walked out. She came to her senses every morning and still made breakfast. That was the only answer she had, and she was committed to it. What she hadn't expected, what she wasn't sure how to account for, was Gideon. Not his coldness, which she'd prepared for and could manage, but the moments when the coldness slipped, which happened rarely and without warning. The evening he'd come in from a long day and found her on the porch helping Lily with a school reading lesson, and he'd stopped in the yard for a moment before coming up the steps, and when he finally came inside, he'd said very quietly, "Thank you," for no reason she could immediately identify. The afternoon she'd been in the barn checking on the mare who'd been favoring her left foreleg, and he'd come in and found her. And instead of the brief exchange she expected, he'd spent an hour explaining the horse's history, where he'd bought her, why she'd started limping 2 winters ago, what the vet had recommended, in the tone of someone who hasn't talked about something in a long time and finds it, unexpectedly, a relief. He wasn't warming to her. She wouldn't call it that. He was something more complicated than warming. He was a man conducting a slow private reckoning, and she could feel it without being able to see it, which was both more hopeful and more precarious than simple coldness would have been. She told herself not to read into it. She told herself to keep her head down and do the work and see what held. She darned the last sock and set it in the basket and went to her room, and through the wall she could hear the quiet house, the wind outside, the tick of the stove cooling, and from somewhere down the hall, the breathing of 2 girls who had started, in the last week, sleeping with their door open. She didn't know what that meant, but she lay in the dark and listened to the ordinary sounds of a household at rest, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like a burden that someone was calculating how to set down. She felt, in a way she hadn't felt in longer than she could easily remember, like she was somewhere she was supposed to be. The morning it happened, the sky had been wrong since before sunrise. Maeve noticed it when she went out to collect eggs. A particular yellow-green cast to the light, low and flat, the kind that sits on the horizon and makes experienced people uneasy without being able to say exactly why. She'd seen that light once before, in the spring of her 15th year, and what followed had taken half her grandmother's fence line and 2 of the neighbors' outbuildings. She stood in the yard for a moment with the egg basket in her hand and looked west, where the clouds were piling in the way that looked almost decorative until it didn't. She went back inside and said nothing about it because she wasn't certain, and she'd learned enough about this land in the weeks she'd been on it to know that weather out here had its own logic, and she hadn't lived here long enough to read it reliably. Maybe it passed north. Maybe it came to nothing. She made breakfast and got the twins off to school and went back to the seedlings she'd been tending on the windowsill and watched the sky through the glass and waited to be wrong. By mid-morning, she was not wrong. The wind shifted first, a hard, definitive change in direction that moved through the yard and rattled the loose shutter she hadn't gotten to yet and sent the chickens into their particular kind of agitation that meant they'd already decided something before the humans had. Then the temperature dropped, and that drop was fast enough to feel deliberate, like something turning a valve. The yellow-green light flattened further, and the western horizon went from building clouds to a wall, moving fast, low and dark, and unmistakably serious. She went to find Gideon. He was in the barn working on a broken harness, and she came through the door, and he looked up at her face and set down the harness. "How bad?" he said. "I don't know this country's storms," she said, "but where I'm from, that sky means serious." He was out the barn door before she'd finished the sentence. He stood in the yard and looked west for about 5 seconds, the look of a man reading something in a language he knows well, and then he said, "Get the cellar open and bring in what you can from the garden. I'll get the herd in from the east pasture. The fence on the east side, the 3rd post, the shallow one. I know." He was already moving toward the paddock. "Get the cellar open." Shut down. The problem with storms that move fast is that fast is a relative term until it isn't. Maeve got the cellar doors open and brought in the tools from the yard and the seedling trays from the porch, and the half-cord of wood she'd been worried about since morning. And she was on her 3rd trip back from the barn when she realized the light had changed again, and the sound had changed. That low, pressurized absence of sound that precedes serious wind, the moment when all the birds have gone quiet and the air holds its breath. Then the wind came. It didn't build gradually. It arrived, full force, a wall of it that hit the yard and took the loose shutter off the house entirely and sent it spinning into the dark and pushed Maeve back 2 steps before she caught herself against the fence post. The rain followed within 30 seconds, horizontal, hard, the kind that stings exposed skin and makes seeing past 10 feet nearly impossible. She got inside and stood in the kitchen, breathing, and looked out the window at the dark yard and tried to see where Gideon was. She could hear the cattle, Not normal cattle noise, the agitated, lurching sound of a herd that has decided to become a problem. She couldn't see anything clearly. Lightning split the sky to the west, and in that brief white light she saw the east pasture fence shaking like it was trying to come loose. The third post. The shallow one she'd set in her first week, the one she'd told herself she'd reset when the ground softened. She should have done it sooner. She was still thinking this when the door opened and Gideon came in, already soaked through, and he said, "Fence is down on the east side. Half the herd's already pushed through." He was breathing hard. "I need to get around to the north and try to turn them before they scatter into the ridge pasture." "What can I do?" "Stay inside," he said. It's not safe out there right now." "What do you actually need?" she said. He looked at her for 2 seconds. A man calculating the difference between what he wanted to say and what was true. "If you can get to the south gate and hold it, there's a section of herd still on the near side. If that gate goes, I lose all of them." "Where's the gate?" "South edge of the barn. You'll see it." "Go," she said. He went. She found the gate in the dark and the rain by feel more than sight, moving along the barn wall with one hand on the wood and her head down against the wind. The noise was substantial now. The storm and the cattle and the particular terrified sound that large animals make when they've lost their collective sense. And the ground underfoot had gone from dirt to something closer to water, each step pulling. The gate was a heavy wooden swing gate, latched with a pin chain, and she got to it as the near section of the herd surged toward it from the inside. She hit the gate with her shoulder and held it, and the chain rattled, and she got it through the post ring and held the pin and leaned her full weight against the wood, and the cattle on the other side pushed, and she pushed back. She was not small. She had never in her life been grateful for that in the specific, immediate, physical way she was grateful for it in this moment. The simple fact of mass and weight and the leverage of a body that takes up space. She held the gate. She couldn't have said how long. Long enough that her arms started to shake from the effort, and her boots had worked 2 inches into the mud, and the rain was inside her collar, and she couldn't feel her hands clearly anymore. She held it. The lightning came in waves, and in one of those waves she saw the yard, saw Gideon on horseback at the far end, moving hard, working to turn the portion of the herd that had gotten through. And then the dark came back and she focused on the gate. It was in the dark between lightning strikes that she heard it. Not the herd noise, something separate, higher. A sound she processed without immediately understanding and then understood. A child's voice. She turned her head. The rain made it hard to locate. She held the gate with both hands and listened past the storm and heard it again. Not words, just the particular high frequency of a panicked child. And she looked toward the yard. Lightning. In the white light, she saw them. Both of them. Lily first, at the edge of the yard nearest the house, and June 3 steps beyond her, and between June and the open east section where the fence had come down, a steer moving at a run, blind with panic, heading directly for the space where the children were standing. Maeve let go of the gate. She didn't make a decision. That is the honest accounting of it. There was no moment of weighing or choosing, no conscious thought that preceded the action. Her hands came off the gate, and she was moving, and the only thought she was aware of was the geometry, where the steer was, where the girls were, and the distance between herself and both. The gate swung open behind her. She did not look back. The ground was terrible, and she went down once, hard, on her left knee, and came back up without slowing. The steer was big, not the largest animal on the ranch, but big enough, running at the specific irrational velocity of a frightened animal that has lost its herd and its bearings and is operating purely on fear. She could hear it even over the storm. She hit June first, grabbed her by the arm and swung her sideways and put herself between the girl and the animal's path, and June stumbled and went down in the mud, and Maeve stayed standing, and the steer came. She did not get fully out of the way. There was not fully out of the way available. It caught her on the left side, the shoulder and hip, a glancing blow rather than a direct hit, because the animal was already trying to change direction when it reached her, startled by the obstruction she presented, and it veered. Not enough to miss entirely, but enough that she spun and went down rather than under. She hit the ground and covered her head, and the steer's rear hooves threw mud as it cleared her and kept running. She was on the ground in the rain. June was 3 feet away, on her knees, staring at her. "Are you—" June's voice was the voice of a child who has not yet decided whether to scream. "Are you—" "I'm here," Maeve said. "I'm here. Come here." She got upright somehow, and June was in her arms and shaking all over, and Maeve looked for Lily and found her 2 steps away, frozen, eyes wide. "Lily, come here. Now." Lily came. She didn't run. She walked fast, the precise coordination of a child in shock, and Maeve got her arm around both of them and got them moving toward the house. She didn't feel the pain until they were inside. It was her left side, the shoulder and the hip, and something in between that she couldn't clearly identify in the first minutes, with the twins in the kitchen and the storm still loud against the walls, and her hands shaking badly enough to make lighting the lamp difficult. She got it lit. She checked the girls, frightened, soaked, unhurt, both of them. And she sat them at the table and put blankets around them from the chest in the hall, and then she leaned against the counter and let herself breathe and took stock. The shoulder moved, which meant it wasn't broken, though it was going to register a complaint about that for several days. The hip was bruised, she thought, deep bruised, the kind that takes 3 weeks to stop being a problem. She'd bitten the inside of her cheek at some point and tasted blood, which was minor and uninteresting. She was upright and thinking clearly, which was the main thing. "You're hurt," June said. She'd been watching Maeve conduct this internal inventory with the attentiveness of a child who misses nothing. "I'm all right." "You're holding your side." "It's bruised. I've had bruised before." She straightened up deliberately and dropped her hand. "Are you warm?" "Maeve." June's voice had something in it that Maeve hadn't heard from her before, a specific, urgent quality, stripped of the usual careful distance. "You got hit." "I know. I'm still here." She met June's eyes. "I'm still here." Something moved across June's face at that, a complicated passage of things that June had been accumulating for a long time and hadn't found an exit for. And then she pressed her mouth together and nodded, once, and looked at the table. Lily had said nothing since they'd come inside, which was the most unnatural thing that had happened all evening, including the steer. She sat in her blanket and looked at her hands. "Lily," Maeve said. Lily looked up. "It's all right," Maeve said. "Everyone's all right." "I went outside," Lily said. "We weren't supposed to, and I went outside because I thought I saw the cat near the barn, and June came after me, and then the fence noise started, and I didn't—" She stopped. Her voice had gone small in a way Lily's voice almost never did. "It was my fault." Maeve came and sat across from her at the table, which cost her something in the left side that she kept off her face. "The cat's fine," she said. "She's under the porch, same as always in a storm." "I didn't know that." "Now you do." "Are you angry?" Maeve looked at this girl who had pointed at her on a platform with absolute certainty and dragged her into a life she hadn't planned on, and felt something in the region of the bruised side that had nothing to do with the injury. "No," she said. "I'm not angry, but we're going to talk about going outside in a storm, and you're going to listen." "Okay," Lily said, in the smallest voice Maeve had heard from her. "Not tonight," Maeve said. "Tonight we wait for your father." Gideon came in 2 hours later. He came through the back door and stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the three of them, twins at the table, blankets, lamp burning, and something in his face did a thing that Maeve didn't have precise language for, except that it was the expression of a man who had spent 2 hours in a storm afraid of what he'd come home to and was now recalibrating. Then he looked at Maeve, and his expression changed again. "You're hurt," he said. "Left side. It's bruised." "How?" "A steer came through the east gap. The girls were in the yard." She kept her voice level. "I got between them." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Gideon looked at his daughters, a long look, the look of a man counting and finding the number correct. And then he looked back at Maeve, and the thing in his face was not an expression she could categorize easily because she hadn't seen it on him before. He crossed the kitchen and crouched in front of the twins and put his hands on both their faces, and checked them over with the efficient thoroughness of a man who has done this before and does not want to have to do it again. And then he said, "Go to bed," in a voice that was quiet and not unkind, and allowed no room for argument. They went, which was itself a measure of the evening's gravity. When they were gone, he straightened up and turned to her and said, "Let me see. It's bruised, I told you. Maeve." His voice was the same quiet it had been with the girls, and she heard in it the same allowance of no argument, and she found she was too tired to provide one. She showed him. He was careful and methodical and didn't say anything while he was doing it, which she appreciated. When he was satisfied it was what she'd said, bruised, not broken, he stepped back and looked at her face. "You let go of the south gate," he said. "Yes." "The herd." "I know. I'm sorry about the cattle." "I don't care about the cattle." He said it with a flatness that meant he meant it, not as dismissal, but as priority. "I got most of them back. The rest will be on the ridge. I'll find them tomorrow." He paused. "You went into that yard. They were in the path of an animal. I told you to stay inside." "You told me what you wanted," she said. "I did what was needed." He looked at her for a long moment. The lamp threw a warm, unsteady light across the kitchen, and the storm was still going outside, softer now, the worst of it having moved through, and he stood there looking at her with water still dripping from his jacket and something working behind his eyes that she watched without trying to interpret. "I rode past the south pasture coming in," he said. "The gate was open. The near herd was gone." "I know." "You held that gate in the middle of that storm." "Until I didn't. Until you let go of it to go after my daughters." He stopped. "I'm not angry about the gate, Maeve. I'm saying, I saw what you did out there. I know what you did." She didn't say anything. He pulled out a chair at the kitchen table and sat down heavily, the way a man sits when a long night has caught up with him all at once. He put his elbows on the table and his face in his hands for a moment, and she understood that this was Gideon at the edge of what he kept contained, which was not a place he let anyone see, and the fact that she was seeing it was its own kind of information. "They're all I have," he said, quietly, into his hands. "Those two girls are all I have left." "I know," she said. He lifted his face, looked at her across the table. "Thank you," he said. And the weight in those two words was such that she knew he was not saying them about the gate, or the garden, or the fencing, or any of the weeks before tonight. She nodded. "You should sleep," he said. "I'll check on them and then I'll sit up a while. Make sure the barn held." She stood carefully and gathered the blankets from the chairs. She was at the hall doorway when he said her name. She turned. He was still at the table, looking at her with that expression she couldn't decode yet, though she was getting closer, she thought, to understanding what it was. "You don't owe us anything," he said. "You understand that. After tonight, you don't owe this family anything." She considered that for a moment. "I know," she said. "I wasn't keeping a ledger." She went to her room and lay down in her clothes on top of the quilt because she was too tired and too sore to manage more than that, and she listened to the storm completing itself outside the window, and the sound of Gideon's boots in the hall as he checked on the twins, and then the quiet of the house settling. Her left side ached steadily, a deep, persistent ache that was going to be worse by morning. She knew that. She noted it and set it aside. What she could not set aside, what stayed with her as she lay in the dark waiting for sleep, was June's voice in the yard, that high, frightened sound, and then her face when Maeve had gotten to her, and the way she'd said you got hit with something raw underneath the words, as if what she was really saying was you came for us. Maeve had come for a lot of things in her life. She'd come for approval and for belonging, and for the basic human acknowledgement that she was not less than what the world kept insisting she was. She'd spent years coming for those things and not finding them. She had not come for those girls in the yard because she expected anything back. She'd gone because they were in danger, and she was the person standing between them and it, and that was the whole of the calculation. But she thought, in the dark, that maybe that was the thing she'd been trying to learn all along, that you go because you go, not because of what comes after. And what comes after is not always what comes after a steer in a storm, not always frightened children, and a man saying thank you with the weight of everything he can't say. Sometimes it's nothing. Sometimes you pay the cost and get nothing back. But tonight she had gone, and they were safe, and that was enough for one night, and she let the ache carry her under into sleep. The girls recovered slowly, the way children do after a fever breaks. Not all at once, but in stages, like something being wound back up by hand. The first real sign came on the 5th day, when Lily asked for cornbread. Not just food, specifically cornbread, with the crispy edge, and could Maeve please not let it burn this time the way Papa does? Maeve made it without comment and brought it to the bedroom, and Lily ate half of it sitting up in bed and declared it acceptable, which was high praise from Lily. June ate more quietly, working through her portion with concentration, and when she finished she handed back the plate and said, "Thank you," in a voice that was still rough but present. By the 8th day they were up and moving, and by the 10th they were arguing about whose turn it was to feed the chickens, which Gideon said was the best sound he'd heard in 2 weeks. He said it at breakfast, offhand, not directing it at anyone in particular, but Maeve caught his eye when he said it, and he didn't look away immediately, which he usually did. He held it for just a second, and in that second there was something she hadn't seen before. Not gratitude exactly, which she'd seen in glimpses, but something more complicated than that. Something that looked like a man recognizing something he hadn't expected to find. She looked back at her coffee. They didn't talk about the storm, or what had happened during it, or the nights after. It sat between them in the way that large things sometimes do. Not like a wall, but like furniture that's been moved and leaves an impression in the floor, and you always know where it was. The town, however, talked about it plenty. She heard it first from Lily, who had gone back to school after 2 weeks and came home one afternoon in a mood that Maeve had learned to read as anger wearing the mask of quietness. She sat at the kitchen table and did not open her books and stared at the wall. "What happened?" Maeve said. "Nothing." "Lily." A long pause. "Ada Hendricks said that the town is saying you shouldn't be here." Maeve set down the pot she was holding. "What exactly did Ada Hendricks say?" "She said her mother said it wasn't proper, that an unmarried woman shouldn't be living in a widower's house." Lily's voice had gone tight and careful, the way children's voices do when they're repeating something that made them feel sick. "She said people are going to make Papa do something about it." Maeve didn't respond immediately. She picked up the pot again and hung it on the hook and stood there for a moment with her back to the room. "Did you say anything to Ada?" she asked. "I told her Ada's mother should mind her own business." A pause. "Then I got sent to stand in the hall." "Well," Maeve said carefully, "the hall part was probably avoidable. But the other part—" Maeve turned around. Lily was looking at her with the particular directness she'd had from the very first day on the platform, that unswerving, unafraid attention that had picked Maeve out of a crowd before she'd said a word. "The other part," Maeve said, "you can keep." The gathering happened on a Saturday. It wasn't called a gathering, officially. It was the quarterly community meeting held in the Blackridge Assembly Hall, a long, low-ceilinged building beside the livery that smelled of sawdust and old coffee and served, throughout the year, as schoolhouse overflow, voting location, and the general arena for whatever the town needed to argue about publicly. Gideon went every quarter, the same as most ranchers, because that was how information moved. Water rights, road conditions, which sections of the southern fence line were causing disputes again. He almost didn't bring Maeve. She saw him hesitate when she put on her coat that morning, and she saw exactly what the hesitation was. "I'm going," she said. He didn't argue. The hall was already crowded when they arrived, which meant people had come early, and people coming early to a quarterly meeting meant the agenda wasn't the agenda. Maeve understood this within 30 seconds of walking through the door. She felt the shift in the room the way you feel weather coming. A slight change in pressure, people's attention moving toward her and then deliberately away. She sat beside Gideon on a bench near the middle of the room, and the twins sat on her left, Lily immediately, and June after only a brief pause, and she kept her hands in her lap and her face still and waited. The first 40 minutes were legitimately about the meeting. Road repairs on the west approach, a complaint about someone's cattle breaking through a shared fence line, an update on the mill situation from a man named Garrett, who talked about it with an enthusiasm that suggested he'd been waiting weeks to talk about the mill situation. Maeve listened and let herself be unremarkable. It was a woman named Opal Gentry who changed that. Maeve knew the name. She'd heard it in town. Opal Gentry, wife of the largest landowner in the valley, which made her, in the economy of a frontier community, something close to an authority. She was perhaps 50, sharp-featured, dressed better than anyone else in the room, with the bearing of a woman accustomed to having her statements received as important. She stood up during a pause in the mill discussion and said, with the precision of someone who has prepared, "I think we ought to address the other matter." The room shifted. Even Garrett stopped talking about the mill. "I'm going to speak plainly," Opal said, which Maeve had learned was what people said before they said something they knew was unkind. "There has been talk, sustained talk, about the arrangement out at the Mercer Ranch." She didn't look at Maeve directly. She looked at the middle distance, the way people do when they want to give the impression of addressing a general concern rather than a specific person. An unmarried woman, living in the home of a widower, with children present. I think most people in this room know that this raises questions about the kind of example being set for this community. Silence. The held, attentive kind. "I don't say this with any personal animosity," Opal continued. "I say it as a concern for order and for what we expect of people who live among us." A man in the second row, Maeve recognized him as the hardware store owner, Patterson, said, "She's right. It doesn't look right." "It's not about looking," said a woman toward the back. "It's about what's proper." Maeve sat very still. Beside her, she could feel Lily vibrating with something that was either outrage or the effort to contain it, and she put her hand once, briefly, on Lily's knee, not to stop her, just to acknowledge it. Gideon had gone quiet beside her. She could feel the quality of his stillness, which was different from his usual stillness. It was the stillness of something under pressure. More voices joined in. Not everyone, maybe a third of the room, but enough to fill the air with the particular sound of people who have been building to something and are glad for the permission to say it. No formal arrangement, no contract. Doesn't know this woman, brought her out here from wherever. No reflection on Mercer. Could happen to anyone. Grief does things to a man's judgment. That last one came from Patterson again, and Maeve felt it go through her like something cold, and she breathed carefully, and she did not stand up, because she knew what happened when women like her stood up in rooms like this, and it was never the thing she wanted to happen. But Gideon stood up. He did it without warning, without clearing his throat, without any of the small preparatory gestures people make when they intend to speak. He was simply sitting, and then he was standing, and the room went quiet faster than she expected. He wasn't a man who commanded rooms. She'd learned that about him. He was too private for that, too reluctant to make himself the center of anything. But there was something in how he stood now, in the particular way his shoulders were set, that made the room wait. "I'm going to say something," he said, "and I'm only going to say it once so I'd appreciate people listening." Opal Gentry had not sat down. She looked at him with the patience of someone who expects to be agreed with. "Maeve Holloway came to Blackridge with nothing," Gideon said. "No match, no guarantee, no one waiting for her. She came because she had nowhere else to go and not much choice about it. I'm not going to pretend the arrangement started as anything other than circumstance." He paused. Not for effect. He was choosing his words, which he always did. 3 weeks ago there was a storm. Most of you know about it. Cattle broke. My girls ran out into it. He stopped again. When he continued, his voice was the same flat, steady register, but something underneath it had changed. Maeve went after them, on foot, in the dark. A steer that was running blind came straight at them, and she put herself between it and my daughters, and she did not move. The room was very still now. June had a fever of 104 for 4 days. Lily wasn't far behind. Maeve didn't sleep, not properly, not for a week. She sat with them. He looked at his hands for a moment, then back up. "I've been running that ranch alone for 14 months. The fencing was down, the roof was leaking, the garden hadn't been worked in 2 seasons. In 6 weeks, she fixed it. Not because I asked, because she saw what needed doing, and she did it." Patterson shifted in his seat. "That's all well and good, Gideon, but the question of propriety." "I'm not finished," Gideon said, and the quietness of it was more effective than volume would have been. Patterson closed his mouth. I've heard what's being said in town, Gideon continued. I've let it go longer than I should have because I'm not a man who likes making announcements. But since this seems to be the moment for it, he paused, and Maeve realized she was holding her breath. She's not a temporary arrangement. She's not a charity case I took in out of pity. She is the woman who kept my family together when I wasn't sure it was going to hold. And anyone who has a problem with her presence in my home is welcome to take that problem somewhere else, because I'm done pretending it's a reasonable thing to be questioning. The room was silent. Opal Gentry's expression had not moved, but something behind her eyes had, the calculation of someone revising. And then Lily stood up. She stood up on the bench, not the floor, the bench, giving herself 4 extra inches, and said in her clearest, carrying voice, "She's our mother. We picked her, June and me. We picked her on the platform when she got off the train." Every head in the room turned. June, who had not moved or spoken, who had sat through the entire exchange with her hands in her lap and her face arranged in the careful blankness she used when she was processing something large. June stood up too, not on the bench, on the floor, because she was June and she didn't need the extra inches. She stood up and looked at the room with those steady, patient eyes and said nothing, but her standing said everything that needed to be said. Maeve felt something move through her chest that she did not have a name for immediately, and didn't try to find one. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. The before silence had been attentive, waiting for something to be settled. This silence was the silence of a room that has been shown something and is working out what to do with it. Patterson looked at his boots. The woman toward the back who had mentioned propriety was looking at the twins with an expression Maeve couldn't see clearly from this angle, but which had changed from what it was before. Opal Gentry sat down, slowly, with the deliberateness of a woman making a choice about what to do with what she'd just heard. It didn't resolve cleanly. These things never did. There were people in the room who left still thinking what they'd come in thinking, and Maeve was clear-eyed enough about human nature to know that. But the tenor had shifted, the way a courtroom shifts when someone says something that can't be unsaid, and the people who'd spoken the loudest were now conspicuously quiet. An older man named Sutherland, who ran a small sheep operation on the North Ridge, and whose opinion Maeve gathered was respected without being sought, said from the back, "Seems settled to me," and that was, effectively, that. Garrett started talking about the mill again. The meeting continued. Afterward, in the yard outside, with wagons being hitched and people dispersing in the particular way of crowds that have witnessed something and need to process it separately, Maeve stood with the twins while Gideon spoke to Sutherland near the door. A woman approached her. Maeve recognized her. She'd been at the general store, one of the ones who'd given her the monosyllable treatment on her second visit. Her name was Frances, she thought. She stopped a few feet away and looked like she was working up to something. "That was something your girls said in there," Frances said finally. "They're not—" Maeve stopped. "Yes," she said. "It was." Frances nodded, once, with the awkward brevity of someone who wants to acknowledge a mistake without making a ceremony of it. She moved on. It was not an apology. It was not the town reversing itself in a wave of recognition and remorse. It was one uncomfortable woman nodding and walking away, and that was the realistic version of how these things actually happened. But it was something. Lily pressed against her side and looked up at her. "Were you scared in there?" she asked. "Yes," Maeve said. "You didn't look scared." "That's the trick," Maeve said. Lily considered this seriously. "I was a little scared when I stood on the bench," she admitted. "My knees went funny." "You didn't look scared either," Maeve said. Lily straightened up slightly at that, in the way of someone filing a good thing away. June slipped her hand into Maeve's without saying anything, just her 3 fingers first, then her whole hand, small and warm, and she stood there looking at the dispersing crowd with that steady, ageless patience of hers. Maeve held on. Gideon came across the yard a few minutes later and stopped in front of them. He looked at his daughters, then at Maeve. "Bae," with that expression she had spent weeks learning to read and still hadn't fully decoded. There was something new in it today, some layer that hadn't been there before, and she thought she recognized it now. It was the look of a man who has said something out loud that he'd been carrying privately and found that saying it had changed the weight of it. You all right? He said. She wasn't entirely sure if he was asking her or the girls, so she answered for herself. Yes. He nodded. He looked at the hall, then at the road, then at nothing in particular. He was working toward something. She waited, the way she'd learned to. I meant what I said in there, he said, about all of it. I know, she said. He looked at her then, directly, and held it the way he'd held it that morning at breakfast, longer than he usually did, long enough to mean something. And the late afternoon light came over the ridgeline and lay across the yard, and the four of them stood there in it, and the town of Blackridge moved around them, and for a moment everything was very still. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to, and he knew it, which was one of the things she had come to understand about Gideon Mercer. He never said more than what was necessary, and he never said less than what was true. June's hand tightened slightly in hers. Can we go home? Lily asked. Yes, Gideon said. Let's go home. The ride home from the assembly hall was quiet, in the way that follows something large. Not uncomfortable, just full. The way a room feels after everyone has gone, and the air still holds the shape of what happened. Lily fell asleep against Maeve's arm before they cleared the edge of town, which was the most honest statement Lily had made all day. The defiance and the bench standing and the caring voice had cost her something, apparently, and now she slept with her mouth slightly open and her hair across her face and her body soft with the complete surrender of a child who has spent everything she had. June sat on the other side, awake, watching the road unspool ahead of them in the last of the day's light. Gideon drove without talking. Maeve didn't push it. She'd learned that silence from him wasn't absence. It was presence of a different kind, the kind that means a person is still with you even when they're not speaking. They were perhaps a mile from the ranch when June said, quietly, to no one in particular, I didn't like those people today. Some of them weren't their best selves, Maeve said. Ada Hendricks's mother was the worst one. You could see Opal Gentry from where you were sitting? I watched her the whole time, June said. She kept waiting for Papa to agree with her. Gideon said nothing, but something in his posture shifted, the barely perceptible acknowledgement of a man who heard that and noted it. People are sometimes afraid of things they don't understand, Maeve said. It doesn't excuse it, but it explains some of it. June was quiet for a moment. Were they afraid of you? Maeve thought about that honestly. I think some of them were afraid that I was wrong, that I was the wrong kind of person, that choosing me said something bad about your father, and they didn't want to be the ones who got it wrong by accepting me. That's stupid, June said. It's human, Maeve said, which is sometimes the same thing. Gideon made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, a single exhale through his nose, contained, but there. June looked at her father, then back at the road, and seemed to file something away, the way she did with things she wanted to think about later when no one was watching. The next few days settled around them differently than the weeks before. Not dramatically. Nothing in real life shifts dramatically all at once, and anyone who tells you otherwise is either lying or describing something they survived that they wouldn't want to repeat. It was subtler than that. It was the way Gideon stopped going quiet every time he walked into a room she was in. It was the way he started the conversation sometimes, instead of waiting for her to. Small things. The kind that you only notice if you've been paying attention to the absence of them. He asked her, on a Tuesday morning while she was turning the garden, what she thought about expanding the chicken operation. Not consulting her because she was a resident who deserved input. Consulting her the way you consult someone whose opinion you've decided to trust. She told him what she thought, which was that it depended on whether he wanted eggs for the household or eggs for selling, and those were two different problems that needed different solutions. He listened and asked a follow-up question, and they stood there in the garden for 20 minutes talking about chickens with a specificity and seriousness that would have looked odd to anyone watching, but felt, to Maeve, like one of the more grounding conversations she'd had in months. You know a lot about chickens, he said at one point. I spent a year in my grandmother's house after my father's business went under. She had 40 hens and very strong opinions about all of them. Did she have strong opinions about most things? She had strong opinions about everything, Maeve said. She was the first person who ever told me that being large wasn't a failing. She said some people just take up more space, and the world needs people who aren't afraid to take up space. She hadn't intended to say that. Came out without her planning it, the way things do sometimes when you've been holding them a long time and you're tired and the guard comes down without warning. Gideon looked at her. He had the expression he got when he was deciding whether to say something, which she now recognized by the slight tension around his eyes. He said, "She was right." It was 2 words. It was also not nothing, coming from a man who weighed every word before he spent it. Maeve looked back at the garden. "She died when I was 17, she said. I've been trying to remember what she told me ever since. October came in cold and clean, the way it does in the high country, with mornings that required a second layer and evenings where you could see your breath. The ranch had changed enough by now that Maeve could look at it and see the difference. Not perfection, nothing was perfect out here, but the difference between a place fighting to stay upright and a place that had decided to persist. The fencing held, the barn roof held. The garden, which she'd started late and tended hard, had produced enough to put up for winter. Not abundance, but enough, which was its own kind of victory. The twins had started doing their homework at the kitchen table every evening, which meant the kitchen had become the center of the house in a way it hadn't been before. Lamps lit, papers spread out, Lily asking loud questions about arithmetic, and June working in silence and occasionally sliding her notebook toward Maeve without comment when she wanted something checked. Gideon sometimes sat with his coffee at the far end of the table and read, or just sat, and Maeve had stopped noticing that he was there the way you stop noticing a sound when it becomes part of the room's ordinary music. It was on one of these evenings, a Thursday with rain against the windows and the stove burning warm, that Lily looked up from her arithmetic and said, completely unprompted, "Are you and Papa going to get married?" The kitchen went very still. June, without looking up from her notebook, said, "Lily." "What? It's a real question." Gideon set down his coffee cup with the particular care of a man who is buying himself 2 seconds. Maeve looked at Lily, who was watching her with that unafraid directness, chin resting on her hand, pencil still in the other. "That's between your father and me," Maeve said, "but do you want to?" "Lily," June said again more firmly, "I'm just asking what everyone's already thinking." Gideon said, "Lily, enough." His voice was calm but had the quality of a door closing, and Lily, who understood the difference between her father's various registers of quiet, went back to her arithmetic. June went back to her notebook. The rain continued against the windows. But the question sat in the room for the rest of the evening like a third adult nobody acknowledged, and when Maeve went to bed that night, she lay in the dark and was honest with herself, the way she could only be at that particular hour, with the house asleep around her and no performance required. She wanted it. Not because she needed rescuing, not because she had nowhere else to go. That had been true once, and it wasn't anymore, or not in the same way. She wanted it because this house had become something she hadn't expected to find and wasn't sure she deserved, and Gideon Mercer was a man she had watched for months with the careful attention of someone who has been hurt by not paying attention, and what she saw was someone difficult and private and imperfect and real. And those were the qualities she trusted now because she'd learned, the hard way, that easy and smooth and perfect were the things to be skeptical of. She wanted it. She didn't know what he wanted, and she wasn't going to pretend she did. He came to find her on a Saturday morning, 10 days later. She was at the east fence line, the one she'd repaired in her first weeks, which had survived the storm in good shape, but had a section she'd been wanting to reinforce before the hard frost came. She was setting a post when she heard his horse and looked up. He dismounted and tied the horse to a fence board and walked toward her, and she could tell from 30 yards that something was different about how he was carrying himself. He had the look of a man who has made a decision and is walking toward the consequences of it. She set down the post driver and waited. He stopped a few feet away and looked at the fence line, then at her, then at the fence line again, and she thought briefly and with genuine affection, "This man is going to make me wait through 2 full minutes of looking at fence posts." But he surprised her. "I've been trying to figure out how to say this in a way that doesn't sound like I'm conducting a business negotiation," he said. "How's that going?" "Not well." He looked at her directly. "I'm not good at this. I want to say that first, so you're not expecting something I can't deliver." "I know you're not good at this," she said. "I've been here 4 months." Something moved across his face, close enough to amusement that she counted it. "Right. He cleared his throat. Maeve, He stopped, started again. When you got off that train, I thought I was making a practical arrangement. Someone to help with the girls, with the house. I told myself that was all it was. She waited. I was wrong about that, he said. I figured that out slowly, and then all at once. And the all at once part was the night of the storm, when I watched you walk into the dark after my daughters without stopping to think about it. His voice changed slightly on that, not breaking, just carrying more weight than usual. I haven't been able to put it back the way it was after that. The practical arrangement explanation. It doesn't hold anymore. The wind came over the ridge and moved through the dry grass, and the horse shifted and the fence wire sang slightly with the cold. I know I'm not... He paused. I'm not easy to live with. I go quiet when I shouldn't. I expect people to understand things I haven't said. I've got 2 daughters who will ask you embarrassing questions at the kitchen table, and a ranch that'll never be finished, needing something, and a town that's going to take longer than one meeting to come all the way around. I know all of that, Maeve said. I know you know. I'm saying it anyway because I want you to choose this with the actual information, not a version of it I've cleaned up. She looked at him, this difficult, honest, guarded man who was standing in a cold field telling her his flaws before he asked her anything, because he thought she deserved the real accounting. Gideon, she said, ask me. He reached into his jacket pocket and brought out a ring. Plain silver, simple band, nothing elaborate. He held it the way a man holds something he's been carrying for a while and is finally putting down. He didn't kneel dramatically. He shifted his weight, considered it, and then went down on one knee anyway. Not gracefully, because the ground was uneven and he had to catch himself with one hand, which was the most Gideon thing that had ever happened. Will you marry me? He said. Not with the inflection of a question, exactly. More like a statement that was asking for confirmation. Not because of what you did for the girls, or because the ranch needs managing, or because it's the logical next step, because He stopped and looked up at her with the expression she'd been trying to decode for months, and she finally decoded it now, here, in a field, with him on one knee and one hand on the ground for balance. It was the expression of a man who had loved someone before and lost her and had been very sure he was done with the whole enterprise and found out he was wrong. Because I don't want to keep pretending this is something other than what it is. The wind came again. Maeve's eyes had gone wet, which she noticed with the detached part of her brain that keeps noting things regardless of what the rest of you is doing. She thought about the train platform in Caldwell, her father handing her a bag without meeting her eyes. She thought about the train car and Dorothea's careful, clinical look. She thought about the Blackridge platform and the women who had laughed, and the long main street with the mud and the leaning buildings, and 2 small girls pointing at her with the unshakable certainty of people who have already decided. She thought about her grandmother, who had told her that some people just take up more space, and the world needs people who aren't afraid to take up space. Yes, she said. Obviously, yes. He got to his feet, with some difficulty because the ground was genuinely uneven, and he was too tall for kneeling to be elegant. And he put the ring on her finger, and they stood there in the east field with the cold coming off the ridge, and it was imperfect and unglamorous and completely real, and she thought, this is what you don't know when you're young and being told what you're worth by people who haven't earned the right to say. You don't know that the thing you're waiting for doesn't look like what they described. It looks like this. A man with mud on his knee and a plain silver ring and the honesty to tell you his flaws before he tells you anything else. He put his hand against her face just once, briefly, and then seemed to feel that he'd used up his quota of grand gestures for the decade and stepped back and looked at the fence. That post on the left is still shallow, he said. I know, she said. I was getting to it. I can help. I know you can, she said, and handed him the post driver. They told the girls that evening, or rather they came in the door and Lily looked at Maeve's hand and screamed loud enough to startle the dog 3 farms over, and June looked at the ring and then at Maeve and then at her father with those steady eyes, and then she walked across the kitchen and put her arms around Maeve's waist and held on with the strength of a child who had been careful for a very long time and had finally decided that careful was no longer necessary. Maeve held her back. She looked over June's head at Gideon, who was watching with that same expression, the decoded one, the one she understood now, and she thought about what this had cost him, opening back up. She thought about what it had cost June to hold on like this, when holding on had gotten her nothing but loss before. She thought about what it had cost her, getting on a train with 43 cents and nothing else, and daring to think that somewhere west of everything she'd been told about herself, something different might be possible. None of it had been free. That was the part they don't tell you. They say things like the right door will open, and where one thing ends, another begins, and those things are not wrong, exactly, but they leave out the cost. They leave out the weeks of work that leaves your hands raw and your back aching. They leave out the rooms full of people who have already decided what you are. They leave out the silence of a man who might not come around, and the child who might not reach for you, and the long uncertain middle where you can't see the outcome and have to keep going anyway. Maeve had paid that cost. So had Gideon, in his way. So had June, who held on now like she was making up for months of caution. And the thing she knew, the thing she'd had to learn the hard way, without her grandmother alive to remind her, was that the cost is what makes it yours. The things you walk into and earn with your actual body, your actual time, your actual willingness to be present when everything in you wants to protect itself. Those things hold. They hold in a way that easy things don't, in a way that things you were handed don't, in a way that even the people who mocked you on a train platform can't take from you because they weren't there for the earning and it doesn't belong to them. She had come west with nothing and been laughed at and judged and assessed by strangers who saw a body and made their entire determination from that. She had arrived in a town that decided, before she'd said a word, what she was worth. She had walked into a falling-apart house and a silent man and 2 children in need, and she had simply begun. Not because she had a plan, not because she was certain, because beginning was the only thing she knew how to do, and it had been enough. Not perfectly, not smoothly, not without setback and cost and the particular ache of not knowing if any of it was going to hold, but enough. Lily had attached herself to Gideon's arm and was talking very rapidly about the wedding and whether there would be a cake and could June and she please be in it, and Gideon was answering with the short, accurate sentences he always used, and June still had her arms around Maeve's waist, not loosening. "You're going to stay," June said. Not a question, but not quite a statement yet either. "I'm going to stay," Maeve said. June was quiet for a moment. "Even when it's hard?" "Even when it's hard." June lifted her head and looked up at her with those ancient, patient eyes. "Papa said that about Mama," she said. "And he meant it. And then she died." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Lily had stopped talking. Gideon had gone still. Maeve crouched down so she was at June's level, which was difficult and ungraceful in a kitchen with a table in the way, and she didn't care. And she looked at this child who had been careful for so long, and careful for such good reasons. And she told her the truth. "I can't promise you nothing bad will happen," she said. "I won't make that promise because I can't keep it. And you deserve promises people can keep." She held June's eyes. "What I can promise is that I won't leave by choice. I won't decide you're too much, or that this is too hard, or that somewhere else is better. I'm not going anywhere." June looked at her for a long time. "Okay," she said finally. It was the smallest word and it cost June the most, and Maeve understood that, and she stood back up and put her arms around June again, and June let her. Anne. They married 6 weeks later, on a cold November morning, in the assembly hall that had last hosted people calling Maeve's presence into question. It was not a large ceremony. Gideon was not a man who wanted a large ceremony, and Maeve had no family to fill one with. And so it was small and imperfect and real. The local judge, a handful of neighbors, including old Sutherland, who nodded at Maeve when she came in as if to say he had always been on the right side of this, and the twins in their best dresses, June's shoes newly soled and fitting properly. Frances, the woman from the general store who had nodded at her in the yard after the meeting, came and sat in the 3rd row. She did not explain herself. She just sat there, which was its own kind of accounting. Opal Gentry was not there. That was fine. Not every story ends with every person arriving at the same understanding, and expecting that is a kind of vanity. The expectation that your existence is so convincing it will change everyone. Some people don't come around. Some people leave a gathering and go home still certain they were right. Maeve had made her peace with that, not because she didn't care, but because she'd learned that other people's inability to see her clearly was not the same thing as her being hard to see. The judge asked her if she took this man, and she said yes, and he asked Gideon if he took this woman, and Gideon said yes, and they were married, and it was done. Lily cried, which surprised everyone, including Lily. June stood very straight and did not cry, but when the judge said it was done, she reached out and took Maeve's hand and held it through the rest of the proceedings, and that was June's version of the same thing. Afterward, outside in the cold, bright morning, Gideon stood beside her and looked at the street that had laughed at her 6 months ago, and she stood beside him and looked at it too. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That it looks different from here," she said. "Is that good?" She considered it honestly. The street was the same, unpaved, rutted, the same false-fronted buildings leaning in their various directions, the same town that had assessed her on a platform and found her wanting. And also, the town that had a Sutherland who said seems settled to me, and a Frances who showed up to sit in the third row, and 2 girls who had pointed at her in a crowd when she had nothing left and said, "That's the one." The same place that contained all of it, the cruelty and the grudging revision and the stubborn, imperfect movement toward something better. "Yes," she said. "It's good." Gideon put his hand in hers, and the twins came out behind them into the cold morning, and they walked to the wagon together, all 4 of them, and started home. The ranch was waiting. The fence that always needed something, the barn with its specific complaints, the garden put to bed for winter and already planning for spring. The kitchen where homework got done and hard questions got asked and cornbread sometimes burned. The room off the kitchen that was no longer her room because she no longer needed a room off the kitchen, because this was her house, all of it. She had come here with 43 cents and a one-way ticket and the full weight of everyone's doubt. And she had built something, not from nothing, exactly, because you never start from nothing. You start from what you have, but from what she had, which was her hands and her willingness and the refusal, deep and stubborn and old as her grandmother's voice in her memory, to accept that the judgment of people who didn't know her was the truth about who she was. That was the thing. That was what she would have told herself on the train platform in Caldwell if she could have. It doesn't belong to them. Their assessment of your worth, your size, your station, your future, though none of it belongs to them. They haven't done the work. They haven't sat with the sick child or set the fence post or climbed the barn roof or walked into the dark after something that scared them. They have looked at the outside of you and charged you full price for their opinion, and the price is too high and you should not pay it. You are not the sum of what people say when they can't see you clearly. You are what you do when no one's watching. What you do when you're tired and there's no one to thank you and the work still needs doing. What you do when a child wraps her arms around you and needs to know if you'll stay. Maeve Holloway, Maeve Mercer. Now, though the name would take some getting used to, had done those things, had paid the cost and earned the ground she stood on, inch by difficult inch, day after unglamorous day. The wagon rolled out of Black Ridge and onto the road home, and the prairies spread out around them under the cold blue sky, and Lily had already fallen asleep against her arm again, and June sat straight and watchful as always, and Gideon drove in the comfortable silence that was his particular language, and Maeve looked at the open land and felt, all the way down into the place where the old damage lived, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because she had found someone to tell her so, because she had stopped waiting for someone to tell her and had gone ahead and built it herself.